Hi guys, well it's Friday, April 17th. This week has gone by pretty quickly for me. Today I want to do a shout out for our two number 17s, Cameron Osborne and Jerry Randall. Hey guys. Also, tomorrow is the 18th, so I want to give a shout out to Mandolin Parsley and Jada Roberts. And then Sunday is the 19th, so I want to give a shout out to Caden Pendergrass and Baylin Sayre. Love you guys. Now, if anybody else asks if you've had a shout out on a YouTube video, you can honestly say yes. And if they ask if you've ever been on TV, you can honestly say yes because of the pledges you guys have done on the news. Anyway, if you're working in the workbook this week, hopefully you finished everything and you can just review what you've done, maybe spend some extra time reading today. If you're working on iReady, remember to do about 30 minutes each day. Read as much as you can. Finish up your writing on Mayan. If you don't have Mayan, remember all you had to do is write a summary of a good fiction book you've read recently. And speaking of fiction books, we're on this chapter now, Two Stout Doors, and we're going to actually read one more chapter called A Fire on the Hearth because this chapter is really short. The questions come from both chapters, so listen for them real quickly. Number one, what two doors did Paul build? Number two, what did Paul not have that most people would think you have to build doors? Number three, what was the main reason that Paul wanted to build a fireplace? Number four, when Paul was gathering the rocks for the fireplace, what did the girls want to do because it was so hot? And number five, what did Laura try to catch as she waded in the creek? So listen for those things, especially on this first chapter, Two Stout Doors. Laura's going to do a lot of explaining about how her dad made the doors. So try to picture each thing in your mind as I'm reading, and if you can't, just hang in there until you can again. Two Stout Doors. Here is a picture. It looks like of Pet and Patty down at the creek with Paul. Laura felt a soft warmth on her face and opened her eyes into morning sunshine. Mary was talking to Ma by the campfire. Laura ran outdoors, all bare inside her nightgown. There were no wolves to be seen, only their tracks were thick around the house and the stable. Paul came whistling up the creek road. He put his gun on its pegs and led Pet and Patty to the creek to drink as usual. He had followed the wolf tracks so far that he knew they were far away now, following a herd of deer. The Mustangs shied at the wolves' tracks and pricked their ears nervously, and Pet kept her colt close to her side. But they went willingly with Paul, who knew there was nothing to fear. Breakfast was ready. When Paul came back from the creek, they all sat by the fire and ate fried mush and prairie chicken hash. Paul said he would make a door that very day. He wanted more than a quilt between them and the wolves next time. I have no more nails, but I'll not keep on waiting till I can make a trip to Independence, he said. A man doesn't need nails to build a house or make a door. After breakfast, he hitched up Pet and Patty, and taking his axe, he went to get timber for the door. Laura helped wash the dishes and make the beds, but that day, Mary minded the baby. Laura helped Paul make the door. Mary watched, but Laura handed him his tools. With the saw, he sawed logs the right length for a door. He sawed shorter lengths for cross pieces. Then with the axe, he split the logs into slabs and smoothed them nicely. He laid the long slabs together on the ground and placed the shorter slabs across them. Then with the auger, he bored holes through the cross pieces into the long slabs. Into every hole he drove a wooden peg that fitted tightly. That made the door. It was a good oak door, solid and strong. For the hinges, he cut 3 long straps. One hinge was to be near the top of the door, one near the bottom, and one in the middle. He fastened them first to the door in this way. He laid a little piece of wood on the door and bored a hole through it into the door. Then he doubled one end of a strap around the little piece of wood and with his knife cut round holes through that strap. He laid the little piece of wood on the door again with the strap doubled around it and all the holes making one hole. Then Laura gave him a peg and the hammer, and he drove the peg into the hole. The peg went through the strap and the little piece of wood, and through the strap again and into the door. That held the strap so that it couldn't get loose. I told you a fellow doesn't need nails, Paul said. When he had fastened the 3 hinges to the door, he set the door in the doorway. It fitted. Then he pegged strips of wood to the old slabs on either side of the doorway to keep the door from swinging outward. He set the door in place again, and Laura stood against it to hold it there while Paul fastened the hinges to the door frame. And here is a picture of Laura helping. But before he did this, he had made the latch on the door because, of course, there must be some way to keep a door shut. This was the way he made the latch. First, he hewed a short, thick piece of oak. From one side of this, in the middle, he cut a wide, deep notch. He pegged this stick to the inside of the door, up and down and near the edge. He put the notched side against the door so that the notch made a little slot. Then he hewed and whittled a longer, smaller stick. This stick was small enough to slip easily through the slot. He slid one end of it through the slot and he pegged the other end to the door, but he did not peg it tightly. The peg was solid and firm in the door, but the hole in the stick was larger than the peg. The only thing that held the stick on the door was the slot. This stick was the latch. It turned easily on the peg, and its loose end moved up and down in the slot. And the loose end of it was long enough to go through the slot and across the crack between the door and the wall, and to lie against the wall when the door was shut. When Paul and Laura had hung the door in the doorway, Paul marked the spot on the wall where the end of the latch came. Over that spot he pegged to the wall a stout piece of oak. This piece of oak was cut out at the top so that the latch could drop between it and the wall. Now Laura pushed the door shut, and while she pushed, she lifted the end of the latch as high as it would go in the slot. Then she let it fall into its place behind the stout piece of oak. That held the latch against the wall, and the up and down strip held the latch in its slot against the door. Nobody could break in without breaking the strong latch in two. But there must be a way to lift the latch from the outside, so Paul made the latch string. He cut it from a large strip of good leather. He tied one end to the latch between the peg and the slot. Above the latch he bored a small hole through the door, and he pushed the end of the latch string through the hole. Laura stood outside, and when the end of the latch string came through the hole, she took hold of it and pulled. She could pull it hard enough to lift the latch and let herself in. The door was finished. It was strong and solid, made of thick oak with oak slabs across it, all pegged together with good stout pegs. The latch string was out. If you wanted to come in, you pulled the latch string. But if you were inside and wanted to keep anyone out, then you pulled the latch string in through its hole and nobody could get in. There was no doorknob on that door, and there was no keyhole and no key, but it was a good door. I call that a good day's work, said Paul, and I had a fine little helper. He hugged the top of Laura's head with his hand. Then he gathered up his tools and put them away, whistling, and he went to take Pet and Patty from their picket lines to water. The sun was setting, the breeze was cooler, and supper cooking on the fire made the best supper smells that Laura had ever smelled. There was salt pork for supper. It was the last of the salt pork, so next day Pa went hunting. But the day after that, he and Laura made the barn door. It was exactly like the house door, except that it had no latch. Pet and Patty did not understand door latches and would not pull a latch string in at night. So instead of a latch, Pa made a hole through the door and he put a chain through the hole. At night he would pull an end of the chain through a crack between the logs in the stable wall, and he would padlock the two ends of the chain together. Then nobody could get into that stable. Now we're all snug, Pa said. When neighbors began to come into a country, it was best to lock up your horses at night, because where there are deer, there will be wolves, and where there are horses, there will be horse thieves. That night at supper, Pa said to Ma, "Now, Caroline, as soon as we get Edward's house up, I'm going to build you a fireplace so you can do your cooking in the house, out of the wind and the storms. It seems like I never did see a place with so much sunshine, but I suppose it's bound to rain sometime." "Yes, Charles," Ma said. "Good weather never lasts forever on this earth." Okay, the next chapter is called A Fire on the Hearth. Outside the house, close to the log wall opposite the door, Pa cut away the grass and scraped the ground smooth. He was getting ready to build the fireplace. Then he and Ma put the wagon box on the wheels again, and Pa hitched up Pet and Patty. The rising sun was shortening all the shadows. Hundreds of meadowlarks were rising from the prairie, singing higher and higher in the air. Their songs came down from the great clear sky like a rain of music. And all over the land, where the grasses waved and murmured under the wind, thousands of little dicky birds clung with their tiny claws to the blossoming weeds and sang their thousands of little songs. Pet and Patty sniffed the wind and whinnied with joy. They arched their necks and gnawed at the ground because they were eager to go. Pa was whistling while he climbed to the wagon seat and took up the reins. Then he looked down at Laura, who was looking up at him, and he stopped whistling and said, "Want to go along, Laura, you and Mary?" Ma said they could. They climbed up the wheels, clinging to the spokes with their bare toes, and they sat on the high wagon seat beside Pa. Pet and Patty started with a little jump, and the wagon went jolting down the road that Pa's wagon wheels had made. They went down between the bare, reddish-yellow walls of earth, all ridged and wrinkled by forgotten rains. Then they went on across the rolling land of the creek bottoms. Masses of trees covered some of the low, rounded hills, and some of them were grassy, open spaces. Deer were lying in the shadows of the trees, and deer were grazing in the sunshine on the green grass. They lifted their heads and pricked their ears and stood chewing and watching the wagon with their soft, large eyes. All along the road, the wild larkspur was blossoming, pink and blue and white. Birds balanced on yellow plumes of goldenrod, and butterflies were fluttering. Starry daisies lighted the shadows under trees. Squirrels chattered on branches overhead. White-tailed rabbits hopped along the road, and snakes wriggled quickly across it when they heard the wagon coming. Deep in the lowest valley, the creek was running in the shadow of dirt bluffs. When Laura looked up those bluffs, she couldn't see the prairie grass at all. Trees grew up the bluffs where the earth had crumbled, and where the bare dirt was so steep that trees couldn't grow on it, bushes held on desperately with their roots. Half-naked roots were high above Laura's head. "Where are the Indian camps?" Laura asked Pa. He had seen the Indians' deserted camps here among the bluffs, but he was too busy to show them to her now. He must get the rocks to build the fireplace. You girls can play, he said, but don't go out of my sight and don't go into any water. And don't play with snakes. Some of the snakes down here are poison. So Laura and Mary played by the creek while Pa dug the rocks he wanted and loaded them into the wagon. They watched long-legged water bugs skate over the glassy still pools. They ran along the bank to scare the frogs and laughed when the green-coated frogs with their white vests plopped into the water. They listened to the wood pigeons call among the trees and the brown thrush singing. They saw the little minnows swimming all together in the shallow places where the creek ran sparkling. The minnows were thin gray shadows in the rippling water. Only now and again one minnow flashed the sunshine from its silvery belly. There was no wind along the creek. The air was still and drowsy warm. It smelled of damp roots and mud, and it was full of the sound of rustling leaves and of the water running. In the muddy places where deer's tracks were thick and every hoof print held water, swarms of mosquitoes rose up with a keen, sharp buzzing. Laura and Mary slapped at mosquitoes on their faces and necks and hands and legs and wished they could go wading. They were so hot and the water looked so cool. Laura was sure that it would do no harm just to dip one foot in, and when Pa's back was turned, she almost did it. "Laura," said Pa, and she snatched the naughty foot back. "If you girls want to go wading," Pa said, "you can do it in that shallow place. Don't go in over your ankles." And here is a picture of Laura in the water. There you can see Laura down in the water. Looks like she might be trying to catch a minnow. And we're about to read that Mary got in for a little while, but then she just sat on a log and watched. And in the background you can see Pa lifting up some big rocks and putting them in the wagon. Mary waited only a little while. She said that the gravel hurt her feet, and she sat on a log and patiently slapped at mosquitoes. But Laura slapped and kept on waiting. When she stepped, the gravel hurt her feet. When she stood still, the tiny minnows swarmed about her toes and nibbled them with their tiny mouths. It was a funny, squiggling feeling. Laura tried and tried to catch a minnow, but she only got the hem of her dress wet. Then the wagon was loaded. Pa called, "Come along, girls," and they climbed into the wagon seat again and rode away from the creek. Up through the woods and hills they rode again to the high prairie where the winds were always blowing and the grasses seemed to sing and whisper and laugh. They had had a wonderful time in the creek bottoms, but Laura liked the high prairie best. The prairie was so wide and sweet and clean. That afternoon, Ma sat sewing in the shade of the house, and baby Carrie played on the quilt beside her, while Laura and Mary watched Pa build the fireplace. First, he mixed clay and water to a beautiful thick mud in the Mustang's water bucket. He let Laura stir the mud while he laid a row of rocks around 3 sides of the space he had cleared by the house wall. Then with a wooden paddle he spread the mud over the rocks. In the mud he laid another row of rocks and plastered them over the top and down on the inside with more mud. He made a box on the ground. 3 sides of the box were made of rocks and mud, and the other side was the log wall of the house. With rocks and mud and more rocks and more mud, he built the walls as high as Laura's chin. Then on the walls close against the house he laid a log. He plastered the log all over with mud. After that he built up rocks and mud on top of that log. He was making the chimney now, and he made it smaller and smaller. He had to go to the creek for more rocks. Laura and Mary could not go again because Ma said the damp air might give them a fever. Mary sat beside Ma and sewed another block of her 9-patch quilt, but Laura mixed another bucket full of mud. Next day, Paul built the chimney as high as the house wall. Then he stood and looked at it. He ran his fingers through his hair. "You look like a wild man, Charles," Ma said. "You're standing your hair all on end." "It stands on end anyway, Caroline," Pa answered. "When I was courting you, it never would lie down, no matter how much I slicked it with bear grease." He threw himself down on the grass at her feet. "I'm plumb tuckered out, lifting rocks up there." "You've done well to build that chimney up so high all by yourself," Ma said. She ran her hand through his hair and stood it up even more than ever. "Why don't you make it stick and daub the rest of the way?" she asked him. And here is a picture of the outside of the fireplace. There's Pa laying down and resting. Ma and I believe I see Laura, and maybe that's Mary and baby Carrie on the quilt there, I believe. Yes. Okay. "Well, it would be easier," he admitted. "I'm blamed if I don't believe I will." He jumped up. Ma said, "Oh, stay here in the shade and rest a while." But he shook his head. "No use lazing here while there's work to be done, Caroline. The sooner I get the fireplace done, the sooner you can do your cooking inside, out of the wind." He hauled saplings from the woods, and he cut and notched them and laid them up like the walls of the house on top of the stone chimney. As he laid them, he plastered them well with mud, and that finished the chimney. Then he went into the house, and with his axe and saw, he cut a hole in the wall. He cut away the logs that had made the fourth wall at the bottom of the chimney. And there was the fireplace. It was large enough for Laura and Mary and baby Carrie to sit in. Its bottom was the ground that Pa had cleared of grass, and its front was the space where Pa had cut away the logs. Across the top of that space was the log that Pa had plastered all over with mud. On each side, Pa pegged a thick slab of green oak against the cut ends of the logs. Then, by the upper corners of the fireplace, he pegged chunks of oak to the wall, and on those he laid an oak slab and pegged it firmly. That was the mantel shelf. As soon as it was done, Ma sat in the middle of the mantel shelf, the little China woman she had brought from the big woods. The little China woman had come all the way and had not been broken. She stood on the mantel shelf with her little China shoes and her wide China skirts and her tight China bodice. Here's a picture of them looking at the fireplace, and you can see the little China doll on top. Then Pa and Ma and Mary and Laura stood and admired that fireplace. Only Carrie did not care about it. She pointed at the little China woman and yelled when Mary and Laura told her that no one but Ma could touch it. "You'll have to be careful with your fire, Caroline," Pa said. "We don't want sparks going up the chimney to set the roof on fire. That cloth would burn easy. I'll split out some clapboards as soon as I can and make a roof you won't have to worry about." So Ma carefully built a little fire in the new fireplace, and she roasted a prairie hen for supper. And that evening they ate in the house. They sat at table by the western window. Pa had quickly made the table of 2 slabs of oak. One end of the slab stuck in a crack of the wall, and the other end rested on short, upright logs. Pa had smoothed the slabs with his axe, and the table was very nice when Ma spread a cloth over it. The chairs were chunks of big logs. The floor was the earth that Ma had swept clean with her willow bough broom. On the floor, in the corners, the beds were neat under their patchwork quilts. The rays of the setting sun came through the window and filled the house with golden light. Outside and far, far away to the pink edge of the sky, the wind went blowing and the wild grasses waved. Inside, the house was pleasant. The good roast chicken was juicy in Laura's mouth. Her hands and face were washed. Her hair was combed. Her napkin was tied around her neck. She sat up straight on the round end of log and used her knife and fork nicely, as Ma had taught her. She did not say anything because children must not speak at table until they are spoken to, but she looked at Pa and Ma and Mary and at baby Carrie in Ma's lap, and she felt contented. It was nice to be living in a house again. Okay, here are your questions. Let's see how well you can do. Number 1, what 2 doors did Pa build? The answer, the house door and the barn door. Number 2, what did Pa not have that most people would think you have to build a door? The answer is nails. Number 3, what was the main reason that Pa wanted to build a fireplace? So Ma could cook inside the house and not have to cook outside. Number 4, when Pa was gathering the rocks for the fireplace, what did the girls want to do so badly because it was hot? Okay, they wanted to wade in the creek. And number 5, what did Laura try to catch as she waded in the creek? And the answer is minnows. Have a great weekend, boys and girls, and we'll do this again on Monday.